Good day, everyone. I'm glad you've decided to watch this session. So I just want to welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about PBR materials, and what this session is going to do is we're really going to take a deep dive into what exactly a PBR material is composed of and kind of how they work a little bit. So before we get started, though, I want to go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Tyler Lamb, and I've been working with the HNI Corporation for over 17 years. And of those 17 years, I've worked in CET for about 9 years. I believe this December I'll kind of break that 9 year anniversary of working in CET. And the role that I have had in working with CET is that I am an extension developer for HNI Workplace Furnishings, which is kind of composed of the various brands of HAN, Allsteel, Gunlock, and HBF. I actually was one of the initial developers on the All Steel extension, so I've been around for a while and been working on this ecosystem for quite a while. And then just to kind of a little bit of fun bits about me, because I think it's nice to kind of paint a mental picture of a little bit of who I am. I have a family with 3 kids that are 4, 7, and 10, so they keep me quite busy. I also enjoy reading and playing video games from time to time just to kind of, relax and take a load off. So before we kind of dive into exactly what PBR materials are, I want to talk about how do we describe materials, right? So if I've got, a material in front of me and I wanted to describe to you what that material looked like, how would I do that? So we'll take some examples of some fun products that I found from a small shopping website online. It's named after a certain rainforest. But so if we're looking at this jacket over here, and I wanted to describe the material of this jacket to you, how would I do that? What are some words that I might use to describe that? One of the obvious ones would probably be, what color is it, right? So I would say that this, for not to get too in the weeds about what exactly the color is, we're just going to say this is black. But then we also need to to describe this more, because if I just am looking at this jacket and trying to describe it to you, and I just say it's black, that doesn't give you a lot to go on to paint a mental picture of what this jacket is. So some other ways that I might describe this is that the jacket is smooth. The material, looking at this, knowing that this looks like to be a leather material, you probably think of that as being smooth to the touch. Something else that you might say to describe that is, usually when I think of leather, is I think of something that is soft. It's kind of a softer kind of feel to it. And then something else we could use to describe this is we could also call this shiny, as we can see, that the light is kind of bouncing off that to give it that shiny feel. It's not very, it's not a dull looking material. It's very shiny. So when you use these words to describe the material, it helps you paint a mental picture. Or it's kind of the term that I've coined with describing this is, when you look at this, it's almost like kind of like feeling the material with your eyes. You can look at this and know that that's either some sort of leather material just by looking at it. You don't even actually have to touch it. So then let's move on to kind of another example. So we have this material here and some ways that we might describe this material. So again, we'll go for the easy one. We're going to first describe the color, right? This material is red. So that gives you kind of a starting point to create that mental picture. And then we might describe this material as rough. So again, that's going to, it helps you paint that mental picture. Again, you're going to hear me talk about this a lot through this talk, is the mental picture and being able to kind of feel things by just looking at them. It gives you that mental feeling of what that material feels like. Kind of the opposite of the jacket that we looked at, I would probably describe this material as a more matte material or a more dull material, because it's not very shiny. And then one other property we might use to describe this is kind of gritty. So not only is it rough, but it has that gritty feel, right? Because there's a difference between something that's necessarily rough versus gritty. And then one more material that we're going to look at here to kind of describe, because just as this kind of demo here of what materials are, is this thing here. So when we want to describe this material, one of the first things we're going to do again is maybe let's talk about the color. And so the color, I would kind of describe this as maybe more of a clear color. Again, it's not necessarily a color, but if you were to ask, maybe a 5-year-old what the color they would say this was, that's probably what they would tell you. And I apologize. I'm kind of getting over a cold, and so I tried to delay recording this as long as possible. So I'm going to apologize for clearing my throat or coughing or anything like that. So just as a heads up, again, sorry about that. I tried to wait as long as I could, and didn't quite get over the cold before I had to get this recorded. So I'm sorry about that. Anyways, another way I might describe this material is transparent, because we can see through it, right? So that helps, again, it helps you paint that mental picture when you see this. And then if we start to think about how might this material feel, I would probably describe this as hard, right? Because obviously we can see that this is made of glass. So I would describe it as hard, right? If you were to feel that. And again, it helps you kind of understand what that material, it helps you paint that mental picture of, it gives you that mental impression of this. Something else I might describe this as is reflective, right? So usually when you think of glass, right, you can usually see some sort of reflection in the glass a lot of the time. So again, all of these things come together to help this material look realistic. And then another thing we might describe this as is smooth, because usually when you think of glass or you're interacting with the glass material, it's usually smooth, so it's not going to have a lot of imperfections or be rough. So these are all things that come together to describe this material. It's not just the color, or obviously we can just say, hey, this is glass, which helps you paint that picture. But when you think of what is glass, then a lot of these descriptions that we came up with here come to mind. And you may have some of your own descriptions of that material that may help continue to paint that, because there's a lot more ways we could describe this, or more adjectives we could put here to describe that. So hopefully that got you kind of an idea of, okay, when we're thinking about materials, it's not necessarily just the color of the material, for example. There's a lot more to what puts a material together to differentiate different materials from each other. So now let's kind of segue into, what does PBR even mean? So first off, PBR stands for physically based rendering. And what that means is that the material describes the visual properties of a surface in a physically plausible way, such that realistic results are possible under all lighting conditions. So that's a really fancy way of basically just talking about what we just did, right? As we're talking about how it interacts with light, how smooth or how rough it is, lots of those things. And again, we'll kind of dive deeper in as we go along in this session to describe what those materials are, or how we would define those properties, kind of in a more scientific way. But so first, before we go into looking at those, I want to kind of do a walk down history lane here. You may be familiar with, there's this kind of small operation that has created a few motion pictures in the past. You may recognize it, you may not, so I apologize if you're not familiar with these, but just bear with me, because I think the content will still be relevant regardless. This little shop called Disney created in the early 90s this animated movie called Aladdin. And so when we look at this, we notice a few things, right? It's hard to differentiate a lot of the materials here. So sometimes, like when we look at Jasmine's her headband, for example, we don't know, we can see that gem on the top, which we can identify it as a gem because they've kind of drawn it in a way and colored it in a way that gives it kind of that interaction with the light a little bit, right, to give you kind of that respect of that, or that view of that it's shiny. But then when we look at her headband, we really don't honestly have a good impression of what that material might be, right? We see that it's blue. We might guess that it could be some sort of cloth material because there's not a lot of shininess to it, but we don't really know. And then we look like her earrings and necklace, same thing. We can understand that those are maybe some sort of gold or metal material because they've kind of got that little, I don't know what you really call that in this kind of animation, but kind of had that little bit of shine to them. But we don't really get a feeling of the texture of her hair or things like that. We just see that she has black hair and she has this blue dress or teal. I guess, I'm not great with describing colors always, so. But so, we can't get a feel of kind of what her dress material might be made of, right? We just know that it's blue and possibly maybe some kind of cloth, but we really don't know. So now, if we kind of fast forward into the future a little bit, once Disney started doing 3D rendered movies, they created this whole concept of a PBR material. So if we jump forward into the future a little bit, there was another movie they created called Frozen. And so if we're looking at this, we start to see a lot of differences when comparing it to the animation from before. So we can see that there's a lot more to this. We get a sense of Elsa's hair, her dress, with the shininess of her dress. We can kind of it gives us a sense that even though we can't actually touch her dress, we get a sense of what that would feel like by looking at it, right? I could maybe say, it's shiny. It might be almost feel like maybe a tiny bit rough on the outside, almost kind of like sort of like sequins in a way. But by looking at it, you get a sense of what it feels like because of all of this kind of extra information they thought about. Again, going back to the examples we talked about before when describing materials. So then if we go into the future a couple years, we have another movie that they created, Moana. And if we look at this here, some of the differences you see as they continue to increase their ability to describe materials, we get some more details. One of the biggest things I notice here is when you compare Moana's hair to Elsa's hair. Moana's hair, almost, when I look at that, it almost looks more, I almost get the sense that their hair is kind of more dry by looking at that, but then you can see the detail with how the light is interacting with her hair on the right side there. When we're looking at her outfit, we can see that it's almost, I would almost get the sense that that's almost kind of like a rougher fabric maybe, just by looking at that. But again, as we look at some of those details, it's the details as time goes on get more and more fine, which give this much more realistic view of any of these materials. And the one that I'm always amazed with too, which I didn't put a great picture of that in the background, but the water in Moana just always has blown my mind, honestly, when I watch that movie. Just how realistic that water looks. I just can't imagine the amount of effort that went into them creating the water for that show. And then if we jump forward again, we have Frozen 2. And again, if we compare this with Moana, you can see some of the effort that they put into the hair kind of has come forward here with Elsa into this movie, that her hair has a lot more detail to it. And when we look at things like the tree that she's got her hand on, we can almost feel what that tree would look like, or feel what that tree would feel like by looking at it, right? You can almost kind of feel the roughness of the wood and things like that. And then with looking at her jacket that she has on her dress, I can't remember which one it is, like the roughness of the material, we can see kind of there's some small detail in there that kind of show, you can almost see this, you can see some of the stitching, which then just gives you, again, the idea of what that might feel like. The kind of pads on her shoulder, I could almost feel like those might be a little bit more hard and smooth, but then when the parts of her dress or jacket there would be almost kind of maybe a little bit more possibly like rough, is kind of what I would get from that. But again, just kind of seeing this progression of the amount of detail that they're adding in that gives it the more realism. And then another movie that's going to be coming out here pretty soon is Moana 2. And again, when we start to look at this, the detail just becomes more and more fine. We look at the thing like that oar that she's holding and her outfit again. There's a lot more like frilliness to her outfit. And so again, it just gives it that more detail of when you look at that, you could almost imagine what that feels like without being able to touch it, right? So it's just kind of continuing to look at those kind of details, that what makes this feel realistic, what brings this material to life by looking at it. And that's, I think, the essence of what PBR materials are trying to capture, is how do we, just by looking at these materials, how do we bring them to life, right? Because when you're going out shopping, right, you can, when you look at a dress or a shirt or something like that, you can, by looking at it, you get a sense of what it feels like. And that's really what PBR in itself is trying to capture. So then, coming to my personal favorite, if we harken back to some of my favorite activities to do in my free time, we have this little game called Final Fantasy VII. So this is a little bit different than a movie per se, but this has an interesting side effect of the game was originally made in the mid 90s, and so we can see that on the left we have the main character Cloud there with not a lot of detail. We look at the bracer on his arm and his shoulder pad, and we can see that those are probably some kind of metal material because they've kind of built in that shine. But one thing that's interesting there is, since this is a very old game, the coloring of that was kind of painted onto him always. So no matter what angle you're looking at him from, that shine color is always in the same spot. It doesn't change. But then when we look at on the right hand side there, we have Cloud, who is actually a much more detailed model because we've had almost, what is that, about 20 years of advancement, 25 years of advancement in technology. But then you can see there's a lot of the things are different, right? Because now we have the realistic lighting that gives that his bracer and his shoulder piece a lot more detail. There's a lot of detail in his hair that we can tell. We kind of almost know what his hair would feel like, etc. So just fun, again, nerding out a little bit, so appreciate you sticking with me on that one. So with that, first, I think we need to also talk about how do 3D models actually work with materials. And so I think a great example of this is when we think of, say, some candy. So let's take this little Santa chocolate that I have here. And so let's think of this as our final model, right? So this would be like Elsa in the movie. So what this thing really is this is a combination of a model and a material. And so to break that down, if we look at the two parts that compose this, and I apologize, I could not find a picture of that Santa chocolate unwrapped, so you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit. But so if we unwrap the wrapper from that and flatten it out, that represents the material of the Santa. So that's what gives the Santa, its coloring, its shininess in certain places, etc. And then on the right, we have the Santa chocolate, which is the model. So that represents, to use a fancy 3D modeling word, the topology, or kind of, it's the what gives gives the model its shape. It doesn't give it the detail of the material. But so when we take these two things and put them together, that's how we end up with a final 3D model for your rendering. So now that we've kind of seen a good real world example, how does this work with computers? So when we are working with computers, we have a 3D model on the right. So I've used software called Blender in this case. So they kind of have this default kind of monkey head that is kind of neat. So when we take that 3D model and we want to apply a material to it, there's a process called UV unwrapping. And the UV is not, it's just kind of a bit of a random name in a way. But essentially what that is it's taking that model and flattening it out so that we can put a material on it. So think of this, if you've ever seen, like sometimes kids, they take a kind of like a piece of paper and sort of cut it into like a T shape, and then they can fold it into a cube and then unfold it. That's kind of what we've done here, is we've taken that cube and just unfolded it to flatten all the sides so that it sits flat. And then so that's what creates this kind of UV unwrap. Again, and then some of these are kind of getting in the weeds a little bit, so if it doesn't make sense to you, I don't think it's a huge deal. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you guys the full picture of everything. So then if we kind of take this to a practical example, so let's look at this little character here. So on the right, we have the final character model. And so on the left, we have the actual material that makes up this model. So this model was UV unwrapped, and then, let's say like the game artist or movie artist went in and drew and colored onto that UV unwrap to create the material that could then be applied to the model. So on the right is actually what the artist deals with, and then on the left is what the artist deals with, and on the right is the final model, to kind of show how that comes together. Okay, so we all came here to talk about PBR materials, so I've been sitting here rattling on to you guys for 20 minutes about pretty much everything but what actually a PBR material is. So let's talk about what exactly is a PBR material. And I see myself as being quite snarky when I was making this, so I put that beautiful subtitle, finally. So a PBR material is a combination of a lot of different things, which we learned when we were talking about earlier describing the materials. So a PBR consists of these different, what they are called, usually referred to as maps of data. And we will go through what these are. So if you don't know what any of these mean, that's perfect. We're going to talk about it, so don't worry. But it's a combination. Just for clarity here, I'm going to roll through these. So we have a diffuse or albedo map, a normal map, a displacement or height map, roughness or gloss map, a metalness map, an ambient occlusion map, an opacity map, and a refraction map. One thing to point out is not all materials will need all of these pieces of information. So I just want to make sure I call that out. And how these things are defined is usually they are separate images for image files for each map. So think of like a JPEG or a PNG file. And again, we'll go through examples. So if it seems confusing, we'll get there. So please bear with me. And how this works is 3D softwares like CET or Maya or Blender, etc., will combine all of those images and their information together to create a final material that is used. So again, since Disney is the one that kind of pioneered this concept, this is just kind of a neat little image that I pulled from their initial kind of white paper on PBR materials. And so this kind of, some of the names here that they use are slightly different, but you can kind of see it gives you just kind of a concept of kind of what those different types of information can impact on a material. And we're going to go through building up an example before this, but I just thought that this is kind of a cool chart to look at and kind of help describe some of the differences of those things. So, but like I said, let's look at building this up with a real world kind of example, if you will. So what we're gonna do is kind of build this material up map by map, so we kind of understand what those maps do. So we're gonna build this kind of brick material that you see here off onto the right. So let's get into it. And like I said, not all materials will use all maps. So if it doesn't make sense, we won't have it. So you will notice there'll be some things here that we will not have to create this material. So the first and most important map is what is called the albedo or diffuse map. So this map actually describes the material and describes the color of the material, for lack of a better term. So this, if you have a fabric with a pattern, things like that, that's what this material is going to be important of. It's going to be important for showing the color of that fabric or material. So if these bricks were supposed to be like a red brick instead of like kind of this beige color or brown color, this image would have that be red. So this describes the color of the material, essentially. And so again, this is what you might hear some of your developers or your data people refer to as a tileable image that we need to have for a material. And so what that means is that the image needs to be repeatable. So if we were to, let's say, print this image on a bunch of pieces of paper and lay them side by side, ideally we want that material you to not be able to tell where one page ends and the next one begins, because when we do that, it will make it kind of breaks that sense of realism, right? When you look at a piece of wood, there's not a hard spot on that wood where the grain suddenly just completely restarts, for example. It's one flowing look of material. And for a lot of us in CET, the real problem is this is the only PBR map or information that we have about a material. Is just kind of a picture of the color or the pattern, and that's it. We don't have anything else. So as you can see, if we only have this, like this brick material doesn't look that great. And that's where a lot of these other maps will start to come into play. So if we move forward here now, we look at the next map, which is called the normal map. And so this map really gives this texture kind of a little bit of sense of depth. And the thing that is interesting about this map is that it tells the 3D software how to fake how light interacts with that material. So what it does is it kind of essentially tells 3D software what way the light would bounce off of that material. And so how that kind of works is that the color of each pixel of this image describes a direction, or again, if we want to get nerdy, a vector for the light and what direction it would reflect off of the surface. And so kind of how that works is the red, green, and blue colors of the material, of the image, define an axis for what way that would point. For example, the x-axis would be the red component of the material, of the image, the y-axis would be the green, and the blue would be the z-axis. So you can kind of see here I dropped kind of a little coordinate there to kind of help you orient that if you're not super familiar with 3D coordinate systems. But so essentially that's how it does. And again, I'm going to kind of break this down with a little bit of an image here because it's really hard to wrap your head around. So if we're looking at this image here, on the top, if we have really without a normal map, or a normal map that's completely flat, which would be defined as maybe if we were to get a normal map that was just kind of a blue tint, which kind of represents that there's really no special bouncing of the light. We can see this black line across the top, and then the purple arrows indicate the direction that the light would bounce. So the light would just bounce straight off of that. But now if we think about our brick material actually maybe has like some concaves and things like that in there, the grout between the bricks. So what we really need to have happen is we need the light in some of those grout lines or concave sections to actually kind of bounce off at an angle to give it kind of that realistic look. So to do that, basically what we do is the normal map is defined as kind of these purple arrows. So what we would do is at the spot where that crevice is that the colors of the pixels on that image would actually reflect that. Hey, it would tell the software, okay, we need the light to bounce kind of at maybe like this 45-degree angle. So then we can continue to keep our model simple as just being this kind of flat object, but then when we introduce the normal map, that can help give the 3D software more information to make it look more realistic without having to actually take the performance cost of making the model more complicated. And so what that ends up looking like here, if we take a look at this, on the left we have that model rendered with only the albedo, or again kind of the pattern or color on the left, and then on the right all I've done is also add the normal map. And so when we look at that, we can start to see that this gives kind of that illusion of some of these brick, kind of the illusion of depth, right? So we look at that, we can start to see that maybe how some parts of this might be slightly higher or lower than the other parts just by adding in that normal map. And for the most part, for a lot of 3D softwares, this is really almost free detail. It does not take a lot of effort for the 3D software to use this information to give us that look of realism. Now the tricky part is, again, getting the map created initially to be used. So if we move on here, the next map that we're going to talk about is called the displacement or height map. And so this is actually quite similar to a normal map in that it allows us to add detail of, telling the software what's higher or lower than certain parts of it. But what this thing actually does is this gives the 3D software information on how to, again, a fun word, tessellate, or increase the model or polygon detail on the model. And this image is a white to black color image only, so we don't really deal with the reds, greens, and blues like we were in the normal map. And so the closer to white describes the part as being taller or more, if you're thinking of it looking at it straight on, that part would be coming out and closer to you, and the darker the color is the further away it is from you. So, and gray would kind of represent a neutral or no change. And so to kind of explain this with a little bit of detail, on the top left here we have kind of a flat plane that's kind of broken out into some sections, and then what if we were to make kind of a weird, let's say, displacement map, is what that would actually do is it would go through and it would actually move parts of that model up or down, essentially. So you can see, like, I could maybe have it so that, like, this area kind of on the left here has been pulled up, this area here has been pulled down, this area has been pulled up, this area has been pulled up, and then has some spots that have been pulled down. So it kind of helps that maybe we could add some extra, finer detail. So sometimes this could be used for, think of like maybe like in a video game, maybe something like if someone was to crash a box into a wall or something like that, we might want to deform the wall to make it look like the box had hit it and kind of dented the wall. So then, this map could be applied on top of that material in that specific spot to give it that illusion, or not really illusion. It's actually going to be changing the model to add that detail. So then again, let's go ahead and take the same thing. Let's take what we had, and then let's add a displacement map on top of that. So now when we do that, is it takes the normal map, which looked good before, but now when we talk about adding displacement, as you can see that is really causing areas of the brick to pop and descend away from you. So it continues to add that realism element. Sorry, I just had to get a drink of water there. The next thing we're going to talk about is the roughness or gloss map. And so technically what this map does is it describes how light is scattered across the texture. So if you have a material that is not rough, it's going to be very shiny. So again, think back to that leather jacket earlier, or the sandpaper from the earlier examples. Something that's very full rough would result in a very matte or kind of dull looking material. So how this map works, again, we got an example from the brick material on the right, is that a spot that is brighter is more rough, and a spot that is dark is more shiny. Now, the interesting thing here about roughness and gloss maps is they're just opposites of each other. So if you have a gloss map, it's just the reverse. So a bright section would be shiny on the material, and the dark section would become more rough. So it's just kind of, you got to just kind of understand what when you're given, if you're given one of these, which one you have. So they're really, again, just opposites of each other. So then if we do continue on the process that we had, if we take that and apply it on top of our material as we kind of continued to build this, what you can see is this kind of gives the bricks, they go from looking, kind of all very rough, to now when we apply this on here, we've kind of get a little bit more realism to it. It's kind of hard, almost kind of hard to describe in a way, but it just gives them kind of a little bit more of like, kind of, again, you can kind of feel it with your eyes by looking at it. I think it just adds, it's not quite as extreme as when we added the displacement map, but it still just gives it that continued effect of continuing to add realism to the material. So then the next material map we're going to talk about is called the ambient occlusion map. So this combines with the albedo diffuse at render time to define how light reacts with the surface. So what this means is basically areas of this image that are more white, that area will pick up more light, and the areas that are darker will pick up less light. And really the way I like to think about this is it really tries to show the areas where light might become more trapped in the material. So thinking about sharp corners, things like that. So again, if we look at this, you can see it's kind of in the grout areas between the bricks that would really be darker, because when you think about that, if those are raised up slightly, really is light's going to get trapped in there and kind of create, some soft shadows in those corners. And a lot of time you might hear this referred to as just AO or an AO map. So then we're comparing this again, if we just continue to add this on. So we've got the roughness on the side, and then when we add the ambient occlusion in there, you can see how this really makes the areas between the bricks start to pop. And by pop, I mean not really pop because they're getting darker, but it adds that sense of realism. It doesn't seem like it's such a flat material. It's these small details that really, it's making the material act as if you actually had these bricks in front of you. That's the reaction you would see with how the light interacts with them. So even though you don't necessarily consciously think about that, that's what makes it look realistic. It makes your brain, it kind of tricks your brain into thinking that that's a lot more realistic. So then what we want to do is let's compare the final results. So when we put those together, I just think that this is kind of a stark comparison. So on the left we have the sphere rendered with only the albedo map, which is, again, I am using this comparison because that's typically what we have in CET. We don't have all of the PBR data, so it can be tricky to get the realism. And so when we apply all that PBR information on top of it, we get this much more realistic looking item on the right because we've added all those bits of information. We've got the ambient occlusion that's giving the darkness between the bricks. We've got the height map and the normal map, which are, helping add detail to the model, that are giving us brighter edges and, things like that. And it just gives us so much more realism. We've got the roughness. So instead of just kind of this just looking like a flat sphere, the roughness is kind of helping all of the areas give you kind of that more dull look to them instead of being so shiny, etc. It's it makes a massive difference. It's just insane. Like I can't even describe it sometimes. So look at that, and looking at all of that, if you guys remember, there was maybe a few of those that we didn't talk about, and how I said, hey, this may not apply, these may not all apply to every material. So some of the ones that we skipped because they did not apply to our brick material, we're going to go ahead and talk about now. So the first map that we didn't talk about was the metalness map, and I always kind of chuckle to myself every time I say that because it's just a silly name, but it kind of makes me laugh. So feel free to say it out loud and laugh. I won't judge you because I do it almost every time. And so what this map is for is that it tells you which part of the material essentially are metal or not. A lot of softwares may have this as just a yes/no choice for the material because a lot of the times you may not have to mix parts that are metal and not metal in a same material. But so that you just kind of, instead of having to provide a map, you can just say yes or no. But you could also provide the actual image map for this because you may have parts of the material that are metal and they're not. So let's think back to the little Santa chocolate that we had before. And for example, if we were to create a metal map for that Santa, we would maybe need to only have like his belt buckle be metal because the rest of his suit, or if he's got some bells hanging on him, etc., those parts would need to be metal, but then the rest of the stuff would not be, his beard, his hat, his coat, etc. So thinking back that, and so if we look here on the left, we've kind of got maybe like a metal material that might be dirty because we've got parts that are metallic and parts that are not. So if we come to look at some examples here, you can see here that on the left we've got maybe a metal material that might have some dullness, or maybe be dirty, kind of a dirtier metal that kind of gives it, some parts are shiny, some parts are not. But then on the right we've got more of a material that's very metallic in some places and then not metallic at all in other places, as we see kind of that groove area between the two parts of that sphere. That's non-metallic, whereas the outer part is very metallic, so it's very shiny. And that's why too, you'll see, especially in like CET or other 3D softwares, when things are metallic, or chrome for example is my kind of favorite example in CET, is it doesn't look great at all until you render. And that's because a lot of the times it needs to be able to get reflections from the environment around the material to make it look good. So a lot of the times materials that are metallic, chrome, or very reflective are going to look better, that's terrible English, I'm sorry, are going to look better when you have an environment that they're in. If you have things that are not necessarily around them that you don't see in the render, but you actually they bring color and reflections to those metals. So we can see, like in the front of that thing on the right, as we can actually see some of the environment that is behind our point of view, but that helps bring color and detail into that material to help make that material look realistic. Another map we have is called the opacity map, and so this utilizes a transparent image, which is typically a PNG file, to define areas of the material that are either completely transparent or just semi-transparent. And how this image usually works is it uses the alpha channel or the A channel of the image to indicate the level of transparency. So I usually think of this on, at least for HNI, we have a lot of chairs, for example, that have a mesh back material that is semi-transparent usually. And so the material, the opacity map, would need to be created for those to define the areas of the stitching that where there's no threads versus where there are, so that light can be let through. And this map on the right here, this kind of black circle, these overlapping black circles. So I intentionally kind of pulled the background of my slide over a little bit so you can see the parts that where it's blue versus there's no background on the slide, or just white, so you can see that those are fully transparent, and then you can kind of see the buildings in the background through those holes. So that, if we look at some examples here, again, I've pulled one of our chairs from CET, how we can see that this kind of purple mesh, we can kind of see the framing of the plastic back through the material in CET. But then another good example would be something just maybe like a chain link fence, right? Because a lot of the times with 3D software, especially like something like a chain link fence, is they're probably, the 3D artist is not going to model the chain link fence to be like a chain link fence. They might just model kind of a flat plane and then use something like an opacity map to create the visibility through that. So those are some couple examples. I'm sure you can think of some examples of some products that maybe you specify in CET on your own, but those are just some good examples I like to look at. And lastly, the one that we're going to talk about is called the refraction map. This describes how light bends through a material as it travels. So, again, excuse me, apologies, getting over that cold. So my favorite example of this is if you have a glass of water and you stick, maybe something that's straight inside of that glass of water, like a pencil here, you can see on the right that we know that the pencil doesn't actually suddenly shift over, right, in the water, but you get this idea of this kind of the refraction of the light in there. And so a lot of the times this may be just a constant value for the whole material, but again, it could vary if you have parts of a material that are transparent or translucent and some that are not. So that's kind of an interesting one to keep in mind there, but that's pretty much it. And lastly, to wrap things up, again, my name was Tyler Lamb, so I hope you learned a few things today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.